This is a 1995 Ford Taurus SHO, and it's a high-performance sedan by 1990s standards. The Ford Taurus was a tremendously popular vehicle in the late 80s and early 90s, and Ford decided to make a fast version. SHO stood for Super High Output, and it was a big deal back then. Today, I'm going to review the SHO and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, good news, this Ford Taurus SHO is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. The SHO was the fast version of the Taurus, like I mentioned, and not many have survived, but this one just had a recent service and it's offered with no reserve. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this Taurus SHO, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Taurus SHO with a little overview of exactly what this car is. So, the Ford Taurus first came out in 1986, and it was supposed to be this revolutionary car for Ford, a totally new direction for the mid-size sedan, and actually, it was exactly that. It totally changed everything in the domestic mid-size sedan world. It was small, it was aerodynamic, it looked totally different from everything else, and it was a smash hit, a huge success. They had a sedan version, they had a station wagon version, and there was even an upscale model called the Mercury Sable, and all of them sold very well. So Ford figured, why not make a performance model also? So for the 1989 model year, they came out with the Taurus SHO. It stood for Super High Output, and it was the fast version with a mandatory manual transmission and under the hood a V6 that came from Yamaha. 3 liters, 220 horsepower, and 0 to 60 in under 7 seconds. Now, this particular Taurus SHO is a second generation model. The Ford Taurus was redesigned for the 92 model year, although really it was more of a major facelift, and the SHO continued on, using that Yamaha 3-liter V6 and the manual transmission. But the manual-only situation was hurting sales. Not that many people wanted a manual performance family sedan. So the big news for the 93 model year was the addition of an automatic, which this car has. Now, obviously at that time, in the early 90s, automatics were slower than manuals, with their slow torque converters and fewer gears, and so to compensate for that, Ford gave the automatic SHOs a bigger engine. Still had 220 horsepower, but it was a 3.2-liter V6, still from Yamaha, and torque for the automatic models boosted from 200 pound-feet up to 215. Now, it's these second-generation Taurus SHO models that seem to be the most desired among enthusiasts today, both the manuals and the automatics. They were kind of the iconic, emblematic Taurus SHO from this era, and performance wasn't as bad as you might think. These cars only weighed around 3,400 pounds, pretty good for a mid-size sedan, especially a domestic one from that time, and like I said, 0 to 60 under 7 seconds in the mid-6s. 220 horses may not seem like all that much, but it was only 5 horsepower behind the Mustang GT from that era, and the 0 to 60 time was only a second slower than a Corvette. It wasn't exactly the best era for automotive performance, but this did a pretty good job fitting in with sedan practicality. Now, when these cars were originally on sale, I was a little boy growing up, and I remember seeing them on the road, and I really wanted one. Younger viewers watching this today may not think a Ford Taurus with some performance mods is all that desirable, but it really was back then. It had excellent performance and some other cool upgrades, which I'll show you, that really made it special and cool in an era where performance cars were kind of hard to come by. why. So what exactly did the SHO get over the standard Taurus? I already mentioned the engine, the Yamaha V6 with extra power, and you get under the hood, you can see it looks really cool. Some say the engine in an SHO looks better than the car, and that might indeed be true. It's a nice looking engine that says SHO stamped right onto it, and just in case you're confused, it also says SHO underneath the hood on the inside, so you know what you're looking at when the hood is up. And it said SHO pretty much everywhere else on the outside of the car as well. The doors got extra cladding on their lower half to give it a more performance-y look, and you can see SHO is imprinted into the front door on both sides to make sure everybody knew what they were looking at. The SHO also got special alloy wheels, these saw blade alloy wheels that sort of looked like a design that the Fox body Mustang Cobra had offered, and in the center cap, SHO is printed. Around back on the rear bumper, you have SHO imprinted once again, just to make sure from every angle you could tell this was the performance version of the Taurus. On the back, you also had dual exhaust, which is of course a traditional performance car cue, and this one had them too, and it looked pretty cool, actually. Now, one other interesting thing to see in the back, you got a trunk spoiler here, and this is one way that you can tell apart the 93 to 95 SHOs from the original 92 from this generation. The 92s didn't have the trunk spoiler, the 93 to 95s did. And since we're geeking out on little yearly changes, the 94 and 95 SHOs had body colored door handles, as you can see here, but the 92 and the 93 models had black plastic door handles, which is another way that you can tell some of them apart. But interestingly, for all the upgrades on the outside of the car, letting everybody know that this is the special one, the interior was pretty much unchanged from a standard Ford Taurus. You did get upgraded seats, which as you can see here, have seen better days, but the seats had bolstering that was designed to be more sporty and performance-y, and over on the passenger side of the dashboard, you had this little panel that says SHO, which was kind of clearly a cutout afterthought they just stuck in the dashes. Other than that, the interior really was the same as other Ford Taurus models from this era. Not really a lot of upgrades in here, but there are a few interesting quirks. Probably my very favorite is the way that Ford did steering wheel audio controls. This was starting to become a thing in the early 90s. Automakers were putting like volume controls and next track on the steering wheel, but the Ford steering wheel from this era only had room for the cruise control. That's how they designed it. They didn't leave extra space for the audio controls, and it would probably be years before Ford designed another steering wheel, so they gave you the next best thing. They mounted a few controls here at the top of the dashboard right next to the steering wheel, so even though you can't tap them while your hand is on the wheel, you can get pretty close. The funny thing, of course, was these weren't that much closer to you than just reaching down to the actual stereo to adjust things, but they were a little closer, and so that was Ford's stand-in for steering wheel audio controls at the time. Now, the other interesting thing in this center control stack is the climate controls. You can see displayed in the center is the climate control temperature unless you press outside temp, and then it shows you the outside temperature. That was either a interior or exterior temperature reader, depending on your preference. Also unusual here is the labeling of stuff. Instead of just using images to show air coming out like the defroster or the vents in the floor like every other car, it writes it out. You can see it says floor or vent or pnul and fleur. So that's abbreviated panel and floor, or fleur and def, abbreviated floor and defroster. They wrote that stuff out for some reason, which seems strange, but there's a lot of strange labeling in this car. For instance, the power lock button doesn't have an image of a lock and an unlocked lock like every other car. Instead, it's this, U and L. U for unlock, L for lock, which is fine until you start selling cars in foreign markets that don't speak English, and then you gotta make totally new buttons, which is why people don't usually do that, but Ford did. Also in the gauge cluster, the temperature gauge, you can see it says H and C, and in the middle, normal. You're not supposed to just know the normal range, it actually says normal written across it. And instead of showing a little arrow next to the gas pump icon to show you which side your fuel door is on, it is written fuel door with an arrow just to make it incredibly plain and obvious. Again, some strange markings in here. Now, the other notable quirk in this interior is that all of the these early 90s Ford plastics are aging at varied rates. And so that means stuff is different colors. You can see the steering wheel center is different from the color of the steering wheel rim. Door panels and dashboard panels that are right next to each other have aged differently, and so their colors are different. It doesn't really look that great, but it's worth pointing out this was probably also true back when the car was new. This wasn't exactly Ford's best era of interior quality, and as these relatively cheap plastics have aged, they're not exactly looking better. But with that said, you got one of these, you did get premium sound. Which high-end audio brand provided the sound? Well, it doesn't say. It just says premium sound. It doesn't say Bose or Macintosh or any of that, just premium sound. It was generic premium sound, better than the generic regular sound. And as you might expect, some of the same quality issues were present in the back as you saw up front. Take a look at the door panel for different colored plastics. You can see they've aged totally differently, and they are very different colored now, although again, that may have been how it was back when this car was new. Now, aside from that rather interesting notable item, nothing else worth noting in the back seat in this car. It's just a simple, basic back seat from a mid-size sedan in the 1990s. Nothing luxurious or quirky or interesting back here. But I do want to finish telling the story of the Taurus SHO. So after the 95 model year, the second generation SHO and Taurus went away, and in 96 they came out with this, the jelly bean shaped, football shaped Ford Taurus. And they did do an SHO version of that, and it had a V8. Again, Yamaha provided the only V8 ever to go into a Ford Taurus, but it was a small one, 3.4 liter V8, and not that much more horsepower. And more importantly, everybody hated the way that this Taurus looked. Ford had taken a risk with this design. It didn't really pay off, and the car started to lose popularity. And then SUVs showed up, the Taurus lagged, and the SHO went away completely until the mid-2010s when they brought it back. This was the revived SHO, although now they called it the Taurus SHO. They stopped saying SHO and just said the word SHO instead, apparently forgetting that it used to be an acronym for super high output. Now, this Taurus SHO was a fantastic car. It used the EcoBoost V6. It had great power, great performance, decent technology. It was great, but in my mind, the Taurus SHO is this car. This is the Taurus SHO, the one I grew up with, the high-performance Taurus. Now, interestingly, the popularity of the SHO spawned a few variants that were also made. For example, Ford made an SHO version of the Ranger as a concept car, although it never went into production. It was a cool idea, kind of a performance truck. In Canada, Ford of Canada made an SHO version of the Mercury Sable, and they did it using aluminum body panels. It was called the Sable AIV for Aluminum Intensive Vehicle. This was years before aluminum body panels became relatively common, and they made a few hundred of these and even sold them to the public, the Sable AIV. It was around 400 pounds lighter than a standard Taurus SHO, a pretty special car, actually. Also interesting, some car customizers and modifiers took the tiniest Ford, the Festiva small hatchback, put an SHO engine in it and called it the Shogun. They only made a handful of these, but the car's especially notable because Jay Leno has one, and because it was a ridiculous vehicle, this much power in a tiny little subcompact car. Ford also made an SHO wagon, but only one or two. It never actually went into production, though it would have been cool taking this fast performance sedan and wagonifying it. And finally, we move on to cargo space in the trunk, which is fairly standard for a mid-sized sedan from this era. Nothing unusual or exciting about this at all. One interesting thing about the trunk, though, when opening it, there's a little latch on the driver's floor. You can lift that and it opens the trunk, but if you want to lock it out and keep people from opening the trunk, you do it there at the latch. You can turn it and lock it, and then the latch won't lift up and open the trunk. Instead of having some other lock system on the trunk itself, you're locking the latch latch and the fuel door. Also interesting in terms of locks with this car, it has the great exterior keypad feature. So if you want to go swimming, you don't want to take your keys with you, you can lock them in the car, and when you come back, just enter your little keypad code and the door will unlock, and you don't have to always have your keys. A brilliant idea that Ford has used on a lot of its cars. All right, driving the second generation Taurus SHO. Now, as you've seen, this SHO is far from perfect. The seats have rips, the exterior needs paint, there's squeaks, there's rattles, some stuff is broken. I mean, this car has definitely been around the block. Usually, I try to review really nice examples of cars, but the simple truth is on these SHOs, they're just not out there anymore. When I was a kid, they were around. It was a new car then, but the attrition started quickly, and they are just not common vehicles anymore. They're not easy to find. So, you know, this one showed up on the site, it was local, and I thought I should just do it before I can't find any of them. So, my thoughts on the SHO. All right, first off, I'm flooring it here, and I thought this was the fastest car in the world when I was a kid. I remember thinking to myself, 220 horsepower, I wanted one of these for my first car so badly. It was 2006, 5 when I bought my first car, and these were 10, 12 years old. They were like 6, 8 grand, and I was like, this is the coolest thing, I really want one. But it didn't work out. And I've always kind of wondered, you know, what would that have been like? And back in the mid-2000s, it probably still would have felt quick. But these days, I drive a lot of special cars, flooring it here, keeping up with the Toyota CHR. No, I'm passing the CHR. But it's not fast. Like, this car is not exceptionally fast by modern standards. 0 to 60 in the mid to high 6-second range. That's just like normal car territory now. Like Corollas and Civics are doing that. That's nothing to think is special. But I really want to underscore that this car was considered special back in the day. Now, one thing I noticed very quickly when driving this car, the steering is like heavily over-assisted and over-boosted power steering. This was pretty common in the days of kind of early cars with power steering, you know, in the 80s, the early 90s, especially domestic cars, which were generally tuned more for kind of luxurious performance, comfortable ride, that sort of thing. And that's definitely true of this car as well. I went and looked quite hard to find, hey, did they do anything to the steering or the suspension on the SHOs to make it better than a regular Taurus? And there's not all that much out there that says that they did. It seems like they mostly kept that stuff the same, and instead they pursued cosmetic mods and obviously the powertrain. I don't think this car was intended to handle dramatically better, and driving it now, it doesn't really feel like it does. It certainly doesn't feel like a sports car. It feels like a mid-90s American sedan with over-boosted power steering. But this era of Taurus was known for being relatively nimble, especially compared to other American cars of its day and later Taurus models, and it does have sort of that 90s car, you know, relatively connected type of feel, since there's just less electronics separating you from the driving experience and less, well, everything, frankly. But I wouldn't necessarily call this like a high-performance-y, sporty car driving it around. It's true of the acceleration and it's true of the steering feel. And I think that at the end of the day, the thing that keeps this car alive and keeps me turning my head when I see one to this day is like the nostalgia factor. Like, yeah, it's not that performance-y by modern standards, but it was cool then, and I remember it as a part of my childhood, something I truly aspired to as a kid. And it's neat to be able to drive one and finally review one on this channel after I've wanted to for so long. It may not have the feel of like a true high-performance car by today's standards, but to me it's cool. And that coolness transcends like numbers on paper, and it's more about just like the ethos and the feel and the look of this car. And I still think this car has it when it comes to that stuff, even if it's not that performance-y by today's standards. And so that's the 1995 Ford Taurus SHO, the high-performance sedan that everybody wanted in the 1990s. It's not much by today's standards in terms of looks or performance, but the young boy Doug really wanted one of these cars, and it's cool to check it out. And you can get this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the SHO a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 41 out of 100, which places the Taurus SHO here against some other sort of relevant cars. The Taurus SHO was cool by the standards of its day, and it's still rare, special, and kind of fast, but by modern standards, it doesn't have much in the way of excitement. I'm still happy I had the chance to review one, as these just aren't around anymore. The younger version of myself would be very jealous I spent the day with a Taurus SHO.